particularly when we think of the urgency of exposing the world to all that is happening in Arab literature today, which I hope we'll talk about. A scholar of Mahfouz, of course, and many other writers as well that should be better known to us. I will mention a few of her works. She's the author of Egyptian Writers Between History and Fiction, essays on Naguib Mahfouz, Sonala Ibrahim, and Gamal al-Ghitani. She also has written other works on Gamal al-Ghitani. More recently, Egypt's Culture Wars, Politics and Practice. And very recently, she's edited several very recent anthologies of Egyptian writing, which provide a fascinating perspective on recent events in Egypt. And these include a literary atlas of Cairo, which traces an entire century of writing about the city and social and political issues in Cairo, and a kind of geography of the literary landscape in Cairo. I highly recommend it. And most recently, 2 books on the revolution, and the first, Translating Egypt's Revolution, which he has edited, and now is working on a translation of a very important memoir of Tahrir Square by the novelist Mona Prince, which I hope we will also talk about today. I know there was an earlier panel this morning about imagining cities, and so I thought I might begin by asking Samia just to comment on the situation in Cairo, where you have an incredibly long history of a literary imagination of the city, really from the beginning of the 20th century forward. So.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I want to seize this opportunity to express my gratitude, actually, for having been included in this wonderful event. I am honored to be here. This is my first time, and all of my friends in Cairo are very jealous of me because I am here, and they all hope that they can be invited in future festivals. And I'm happy to recommend many names who are far more, I think, will do a far better job than I, if included. And I also hope, I have to say that I have been inspired by your initiative here, and I hope to copy it soon in Cairo. And as a follow-up on what we were saying yesterday, I was just corresponding with friends on Facebook and thinking about calling it the novel in the global south, and we were contesting yesterday the whole panel about beyond the global novel, and I think that might be one way of sort of making the reality of a conversation, a south-south conversation, come true. Okay, so to go back to your question now about imagining the city and the city as a political space. In Mahfouz, I will begin with Mahfouz, because Mahfouz is one of the earliest architects literary architects of the city of Cairo. He is a Cairean. He never left Cairo. He was sort of terribly rooted and only left Egypt on 2 very brief occasions. Even when he was awarded the Nobel Prize, he did not travel to receive it himself. He delegated his daughters. And all of his work is about the city as it grew and changed. And it's also about his own displacement and the displacement of his characters from the historic city, the old city of Cairo, to the more modern neighborhoods, to Abbasiyya first, and then to Belle Epoque Cairo, or colonial Cairo, where that stands at the threshold really of Tahrir Square, that was then Ismailiyya Square. It acquired its name, Tahrir Square, only after the 1992 revolution. And so, to go back to this idea of him being a cartographer, really, of the city, but also a political cartographer. And I want to focus for a moment on that navel that has become so important in our lives and has been important in Cairenes' lives for over a century. Because Tahrir Square, or Ismailiyya Square, then was also the epicenter for the 1919 revolution. And there are many scenes actually in the trilogy, to go back to the trilogy that is supposed to be the focus of today's panel. There are many scenes that are identical actually to what we have witnessed in Tahrir in January 11. And I was telling you just yesterday that when teaching the trilogy after the uprising, these scenes suddenly jumped out of the text at me in ways that they had not necessarily done before, because of the descriptions of the demonstrators, the slogans, the firing, the violence against them, the deaths and the injuries, but also the language of the text. Obviously, in 1919, Egyptians were in Ismailiyya Square against British colonialism. But later on, as that same epicenter is represented through dozens of literary texts, those who are actually practicing the violence against the perpetrators of the violence are the Egyptian police and military at times.
Well, there's something very interesting here, thinking about how we read Mahfouz today, and as an Egyptian, can one not read Mahfouz today without the context of the recent events? And one of the themes that we think of in Mahfouz is the Egyptian family, and what happens to the family in encountering politics, and the trauma of politics, and the son who is killed. And how is the family today seen in literature and in the reality of what's happened over the last few years?
Let me begin by saying, of course, that the trilogy is a family saga. I mean, we follow 3 generations over 3 volumes of the trilogy. But actually, so there's that sort of literal meaning of family, where you actually see, a household and the hierarchies, the relationships of power within that household, where you have a patriarch who dominates all of the members of the family, and who the trilogy ends actually with the fall of the patriarch after the loss of the son, who is killed in one of the demonstrations. And to go back to reading the trilogy today, I think that family takes on a metaphoric dimension, because the patriarch, of course, is still there, right? This is what we are experiencing and living in Egypt today, even after the January uprising. And the death of the son is what is happening to our young activists and the entire generation that has participated in the January uprising, many of whom are, languishing in Egyptian jails after the revolution. And therefore, suddenly this family, this Egyptian family, takes on this metaphoric dimension that may have not necessarily been there, initially. But to address your question on what has happened to the family in other literary works, and I have written about this looking at literary production since the 1990s, and in that particular article that then became a chapter in this book, Egypt's Culture Wars, I actually argue that the family has disappeared from literary texts. And what we witness in the more recent literary production is texts about individuals, alienated individuals. We know nothing about their families, actually, and they never talk about them. And it really describes very candidly the position of writers, real position of writers in the urban context today, where they are isolated, solitary beings with no connections to that network of family and kinship, etc. And it has to do with what the city has become: migration patterns, marginalization, inclusion and exclusion of all of these new arrivals to the city of Cairo.
Well, it's very interesting, and this, of course, raises the question: we're here today, and we're supposed to talk about Mahfouz, but almost inevitably, what comes to bear are the recent political developments, and understanding how this politics of this literary politics that really began in the early 20th century has gone forward in time again and again. There have been revolutions, political change. Mahfouz himself wrote about the assassination of Sadat, but many other writers, and at a certain moment, were really thinking about reacting against Mahfouz, and I want to talk about that when you mentioned the 1990s and the kind of literary generation leading up to our present moment. How did they see Mahfouz, and where were they going in this new direction? What were the sort of their own sources of?
Let me start by saying, of course, that Mahfouz is monumental and will continue to be monumental, inspirational as a model, but also as a model to perhaps emulate, but also, more importantly, a model to challenge and rebel against. And I think that the literary production from, say, the second half of the 20th century onward has witnessed this rebellion, writing against Mahfouz. So let me give one very important example. Mahfouz, of course, was famous for having developed what is referred to as the third language. The third language being a language that sort of situates itself between a formal written Arabic and a vernacular spoken Egyptian Arabic. But he never used Egyptian Arabic. He was able to move very close to street language by using a familiar everyday lexicon that actually traveled between both registers, that is, the formal and the vernacular. So much so that for us Egyptians, as we read him in this third language. We actually translate him into the vernacular because of the lexicon, but also the idiomatic expressions, etc., that are used. But he never ever crossed that line and to write in the vernacular, and has always been accused by younger writers of having failed to represent some of his characters because they are, more popular characters, women particularly from, traditional backgrounds, and that their dialogues in the texts rang false, because nobody would speak like that from these particular social strata. What they have done, therefore, as several consecutive generations, is work on that and move us forward into, daringly, I would say, into the vernacular, despite a tremendous lot of criticism and resistance to institutional, literary institutional resistance to triumphing and the vernacular over the written, with arguments like, we are destroying our beautiful language. This means that it's going to sort of fragment the Arab literary scene, because suddenly Arabs will not be able to read each other's dialects. But despite all of this, all of the Arab writers today, in all of the Arab countries, have moved us forward to the use of the vernacular, and I think that has been very important as a, writing, as one example of writing against Mahfouz.
Well, it's interesting, and to think maybe this began with Mahfouz himself. I think you talk about this in your book, Politics and Change, that thinking about the moment when the trilogy is finished, and there was the revolution in the 50s, and then his next book is Children of
Abba Ali.
And you use this in your discussion of the Mahfouz Prize, which is a literary prize that was set up in the 1990s by the American University, and it's a very interesting prize that confers on the winner immediate translation. So there is this aspect of translation that is very, in some way, Mahfouzian, and can you talk about that and the sort of origins of this?
Sure. Yeah, I think we all need to remind ourselves that we are reading...
I'm sorry, I just wanted to interrupt that Samia also was chairman of this prize. I should have said...
Yes, I did chair the committee, the selection committee for the Naguib Mahfouz Award that is given out annually to a work by an Arab writer, and with a promise of translation, so that the selected work is eventually translated and is out there. And the American University can now pride itself on being the publisher of Arab works in English translation. They have the biggest, longest, and most distinguished, I would say, list of translations. I just wanted to remind us all that we are reading Mahfouz here, at least in translation, right? You're all reading him in English. And I think that's important to remember, that we are reading him in translation. And to also remember that Mahfouz's translated works really trickled down very, very slowly until he won the Nobel Prize. And that was a turning moment in the history of Naguib Mahfouz's translations into English. This is when, the entire industry, if you will, around Mahfouz actually started. So much so that the American University Press has now translated all of Mahfouz's works. They are his publisher, and all of his works are available in English. The importance of the Naguib Mahfouz Award at AUC, of course, lies in the fact that it has shifted attention from Mahfouz as the icon, right, of Arab literary production and has opened the way to other younger Arab literary producers whose names had never been heard, whose works had never been seen, and of course never even contemplated as works that would be translated into English. And therefore, he also, Mahfouz, is monumental and important in the sense that it is his work and his presence, his name really, that has offered this new space, opened up this new space for a younger literary generation that continues to work against him, which I think is fantastic, even as it recognizes its genealogy, recognizing him as the father. But he is the father that has to be killed.
Well, and the work you're now translating by Mona Prince, her first novel was, in a sense, a reaction to Mahfouz. Can you talk about that?
Sure. This is a translation that I have just completed, and I must say that I love this work dearly because I think that it is a work that was translating the work for me was very therapeutic. And it was therapeutic because I was translating it when the Muslim Brothers were in power. And every day I would sit and try to forget what was happening in Egypt by focusing on translating this work. And this work is by a dear friend who is an academic, a novelist, and an activist. And she was a very important figure in Tahrir during the 18 days of the uprising. She never left the Midan and, participated on various levels in the Midan's activities as one of the, she secured the borders, she cooked for the protesters, she got beaten, arrested, she danced and sang, everything. She was just part of the entire experience. And throughout the 18 days, she made it a point of recording the day's events on her Facebook page that then became an archive for this beautiful memoir of Tahrir during the 18 days. And I was telling you that I see her work, again, as a work that stands against Mahfouz. One, because she is a woman, right? And it's not just the men who are demonstrating and dying. It's also the women. But she's the woman chronicler of the city as well. She's the woman historian that stands against him as a chronicler of, political moments. She is also the fabulator and the inventor of language, if you will, that is very different from Mahfouz's. What characterizes Mona's text is actually the language of Tahrir itself. How funny it was, political satire, jokes, the way, the vernacular, as I said, that saturated the entire experience, of course. And so in these many ways, her text stands against his as a representation of another moment of uprising. So it's both political uprising, but also literary uprising, if you will.
Literary uprising is such an interesting way of thinking about it, and I just wanted to read briefly a quote from your book, The Literary Life of Cairo, and you have a section called "The Street is Ours?" ? And the role of the street again and again in so many literary texts. Is kind of astonishing, particularly juxtaposed against years of actual stasis in political life. And you had this interesting point where you said there was this staggering overabundance of literary representation of public protest, even when there was quiet on the streets and a near absence of political protests on the streets. And so this is a very interesting notion that, in fact, in the life of literature, there's been an almost constant return to political contestation. And so then what happens when it actually does come into the street? And I think this is a really interesting theme that we're you know, I think we don't have such an awareness of. And
yeah, I think I say also that as, you know, the street is dominated by the stasis and quiet, the literary text becomes the space for actual resistance. That's where it all comes out. That's where you get all of the representations, not just of street politics and demonstrations and mobilizations, but also of torture, of prisons, and all of these writers have been imprisoned at one point or another and have written about these experiences as part of mobilized masses, multitudes on the street, but also as prisoners of those moments, because of those moments. The second half of your question is, what happens when that actually becomes the real street?
yeah.
That's a very interesting question, because suddenly today we have no representations of that moment, this moment that we have just lived through. And when asked, many writers have been asked, you know, when are you going to write the novel of the revolution, right? And I think many of them are still wary of addressing or representing the moment. Mehrez was a very immediate representation of the 18 days. There are many other memoirs that have actually been published, but none of them are able to capture the spirit of the moment as much as hers does. But the street has silenced the literary text for the moment, I think. And it's going to take a while before people, you know, this literati actually turns around in order to speak about the actual uprising in literary terms.
To return to Mahfouz, there was this period of silence in his own work, right, after 1952.
Exactly.
And in fact, when we think of the trilogy, he was writing about 1919 from the vantage point of 30 years later.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very important point that you've just made, because that also was the case with Mahfouz, who went through almost 9 years of silence after the 1952 revolution. He didn't write anything at all, and it took him that long, I think, to be able to sort of stomach what had happened. And when he did write, he didn't write about that moment at all. Or he wrote about it in very metaphoric terms that got him into immediate trouble. You may know of the famous case against Mahfouz because of his novel Children of Gabalawi, أولاد حارتنا, a novel that led to major demonstrations in the country against him and accusations against him of being an apostate, basically, a non-believer. And this, by the way, surfaced again in 1988 after he was awarded the Nobel Prize, and it became a major contention. You know, how can you give Mahfouz award him the Nobel Prize when he is a non-believer, basically? And it was at that moment that he was compared to Salman Rushdie, because Salman Rushdie's crisis had also just occurred, and there was a fatwa issued against him that he should be killed, basically. And you may all know that in 1994 he is indeed stabbed to kill, but the person who stabbed him missed, and it only injured his arm, but then led to a permanent paralysis of his arm, and he spent the later years of his life dictating his columns and works rather than writing them, because he couldn't actually write anymore. But yes, I think that significant moments of change and transformation require a lot of reflection on the part of literary producers before they can actually come out and represent them.
And in a very real sense, the violence of the street returned to actually, I mean, in a tragic way, to attack, in a way, the voice of literature.
Right.
And it's interesting to think about what reflection will emerge, as we go forward in this new generation of an extremely vibrant generation, as you've shown in your work, and as we're beginning to see finally in translation that we should see much more. What will emerge from this? And I wanted to return to some of the issues that were preoccupying this. You talked about earlier this kind of the kind of individual and this sort of disaffection that this young generation in the 2000s, the millennial generation, things they were thinking about. And actually, I want, if I may, I just want to read briefly another passage from your book, because this is a very different theme, but it may help us think about what is happening against Mahfouz today. And you talk about a young novelist. This fits very much in our discussion yesterday about the global novel. And this is Ahmed Aladi's, I guess you would translate it as being
Abbas al-Abd.
Yeah, and you say, a disturbingly candid reflection of Egypt's young generation at the turn of the century. It echoes the intensity of Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club and the hip sensibility of Douglas Coupland's Generation X, while involving a mind-boggling range of references to global consumer culture from the media, film industry, communication technology, as well as Cairo's underworld of microbus culture, pharmaceutical abuse, prostitution, experimental psychiatry, all audaciously rendered in an irreverently hybridized everyday street Arabic that breaks down the barriers between the written and the spoken. And then there's this passage you quote from the book where he says, if this were a novel, it would now be time for you to stop and have a sandwich. Unfortunately, however, it isn't. This is not a novel. And I just thought this gives a little bit of the flavor of some of the currents that were, can you just maybe elaborate?
Yeah, Ahmed Laidi is a very interesting example, of course, of writing against Mahfouz, but also writing against the very genre that Mahfouz represents, which is the novel. And I think that many of the young writers today are actually experimenting tremendously with form and are refusing to call their works necessarily novels. And we talked also, I think, about how bloggers have become novelists and how these bloggers have forced themselves through their very powerful narratives in the vernacular on publishers, so that these blogs have actually been published by major publishers and translated into English. By the way, one of them I mentioned yesterday in the other panel is by a woman writer, and in Arabic it is entitled "Ana Awza Atgawaz," I want to get married, and it's about this young middle-class woman who wants to get married, and then describes all of the impediments, societal impediments that stand between her and that project of getting married. But also, of course, another very important thing to speak about about these writers is who they are. Who are these writers today? And again, Mahfouz is very important in this respect, because Mahfouz is the middle class, right? He is the writer of the middle class par excellence. He himself is of the middle class and has represented that middle class, the Cairean middle class, for almost close to a century. These younger writers are, many of them are immigrants to the city and therefore are marginal to the city. Many of them, even when Cairean, actually occupy marginalized positions both geographically and socially within the city, and therefore their realities, their everyday realities, are these kinds of realities that dominate, informal settlements, and the periphery, which I said yesterday, has actually become the center of the city. This is Cairo today, whether we like it or not.
Maybe now we could open up to a few questions if people would like to ask here. Do we have a microphone?
Can I ask?
Good morning. Welcome to Pakistan, and I have two questions. I'm a translator based in Lahore. I was in Cairo in 2006, and I spent 15 days, and it is my eternal regret that I did not meet Naguib Mahfouz, although I spent a lot of time in the Fishawi Cafe, which, he used to frequent. But let me try to compensate for that by asking you two questions. We are, of course, here to discuss the Cairo Trilogy, but I want to ask you, is this Mahfouz's most significant work? I mean, because from what I know about Mahfouz, which is limited, there are other novels also which very presciently deal with what's happening in Egypt today. I mean, of course, the Cairo Trilogy has a lot of traction in the West. Is that the reason why it is considered to be his most important work? Secondly, you talked about other works, apart from Mahfouz, other writers in Egypt who are also important. I recently read Tawfiq al-Hakim's novel, Return of the Spirit, which has recently been translated into English, did not receive a lot of attention, although it talks about a military uprising, and as I know, it was banned it was actually liked by Nasser because it, talks about that whole context. And the novel actually has been compared to James Joyce, portrait of the artist as a young man, the protagonist. So why don't we talk about those novels also? I mean, not you, but, when the West talks about the Arab world, they only talk about Mahfouz. But what you say is there is a whole panoply of writers who are bursting from the seams. Thank you very much.
Okay, on the trilogy and the importance of the trilogy, I think that the trilogy may not be his most important work, but it's definitely the work that sort of marks the climax of his career. This is the chef-d'oeuvre, this is the work that he completes just before 1952. It is all written before 1952 and published later in 1956. And that's what establishes him solidly and squarely as a novelist. And I think that is very important because prior to Mahfouz and Mahfouz's career, the novel was looked down upon. It was looked down upon as a frivolous kind of enterprise. His predecessors were referred to as men of letters, al-udaba, right? Udaba, mufakkirun, intellectuals. But none of them, even though, including Tawfiq al-Hakim, by the way, wrote novels, but that activity in and of itself was not taken seriously as part of their CV, if you will. All right. So even if the trilogy is not the most relevant work to what is happening today, and I would argue that it is actually, because I just said that it is a metaphor for what Egypt is today. I think it is an important milestone in his lifelong career. Why don't we hear about other writers? Well, I think we talked a little bit about that yesterday. The flow of cross-cultural conversations is such, and the balance of power is such between literary geographies that, many of these writers, very important writers, have fallen off the global map, right? I think that, and that's why I'm suggesting a South-South dialogue.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Could you just ask a single question, if possible, just so we have more people to have a chance?
My question is to the writer. You talked about the metaphor of family, and it's very interesting. This side.
I'm sorry.
You talked about the metaphor of family, and I'm referring in this case to Mahfouz's Yes Sir and the Day the Leader Was Killed. I find a very interesting thread, and that is the absence of the present generation. There is a link between the past, that is the grandfather, and the younger children, but you find that there's a certain silence about the parents. Could you comment on that?
That's in which work are you addressing?
Yes, Sir, and The Day the Leader Was Killed, and other works as well by Mahfouz.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I think that the parents, I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that there's this relationship between the grandfather and the grandchild, who is not a child really, he's a young man. But the parents are absent. They're absent because they're absent politically. It's an absent generation, basically. And that's why they are simply not there in the work, and rightly so. They had to be written as such because if you recall in the text, they're constantly milling around trying to make ends meet and they have absolutely no political presence or even social presence. And it was one way for Mahfouz to sort of say that an entire generation has been amputated from history. And so he amputates that generation from the text itself and focuses therefore, but also the counterpoint, the grandfather and the grandchild. The grandfather, of course, is saturated with nostalgia for an earlier historical moment, the 1919 revolution, of course, and awaiting another one that his young grandchild would eventually become engaged in. And then you have the assassination of Sadat, that becomes the counterpoint really to the 1919 revolution. And in the middle there is nothing, there is void.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.